Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome. My name is Karen Beckman, and I'm the Interim Director of the Penn Humanities Forum. Thank you for coming, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Before we go any further, please turn off all your cell phones and camera flashes. I know that some of you are anxious to make it to the lecture that follows this one at 7 p.m., so I just want to reassure you. 6, sorry. We're going to stop at about 5 to 6 so that you have a chance to get over to that lecture. So we'll take a pause there, and then when the people who've left have gone, then we'll continue with question and answers. Okay. So C. Brian Rose is the James B. Pritchard Professor of Mediterranean Archaeology in the Department of Classical Studies and the curator in charge of the Mediterranean section here at the Penn Museum. In a moment, I'll tell you more about his career path and his research interests, but to begin, I want simply to note that I consider Brian to be a truly extraordinary human being and the embodiment of everything that you would hope to find in a humanities professor. And I think you'll find my introduction for him is going to seem excessive, but it's absolutely right, I think, for him. He's just really an extraordinary person. After meeting him for the first time, I can remember thinking to myself, wow, I just love it. He's so smart. And he really is super intelligent in a way that's so pleasurable. Nobody's work illustrates more clearly why the humanities and a vivid understanding of the past matter in ways that are crucial to our daily life. No one is more generous and modest, and nobody knows more about Betty Davis, but that's another story. He's one of the busiest people I know at Penn, yet he is always the first to respond to calls for volunteers, for example, to give our graduate students practice interviews as they prepare for the academic job market. And when a local high school teacher wrote to see if one of our forum presenters could come to speak with faculty and students at the school about the topic of violence, Brian immediately offered to go. He has what seems to be a natural ability to make his own passions contagious. Although I'm a film scholar and far from Brian's field, when I hear him speak about his research, I find myself thinking, I wonder if he'd let me join a Gordian expedition. It just sounds so fun and awesome. To give you some sense of how Brian involves students in the most exciting parts of his projects, I want to quote a brief passage from a short article he wrote about the Gordian excavation in which he's involved. After describing the thrilling discovery of an enormous structure at the site using remote sensing, Brian offers the following report that accompanies photographs of students hard at work, on hands and knees, and looking absolutely thrilled to be in that position. He writes, "This was not an easy trench to excavate, since it lay on the south slope of the Citadel Mound, and we owe a major debt of thanks to the trench supervisors, Sarah Leopard and Simon Greenslade, as well as their assistants, Penn graduate students Lucas Stevens and Curtis Tanaka, Mehmet Khan Soylugalo of Ankara University, and Hussein Erol of Hacettepe University. Remote sensing and surveying activities were immeasurably aided by Penn graduate student Patricia Kim and Penn undergraduate Jean Hurley." As this brief passage illustrates, Brian is a teacher who not only extends the Penn classroom out into the world, but one who also fosters international collaboration and friendship across generations of scholars through his research and teaching agendas. Such friendships, I believe, are crucial antidotes to violence in themselves, but the future of globally oriented research also depends upon these friendships, and it takes people like Brian to foster and nurture them. Prior to coming to Penn, Brian taught in the Classics Department of the University of Cincinnati from 1987 to 2005, serving as head of the department there from 2002 to 2005 and as Cedric Bolter Professor of Classical Archaeology. Though we send our deepest apologies to Cincinnati, it was nevertheless a fine day when we snatched him away and brought him to Penn, and there was a little cheer at our faculty meeting. He served as deputy director of the Penn Museum here between 2008 and 2011, and in that role he dealt with countless complicated and difficult challenges with a characteristic grace and intelligence. Brian received his BA from Haverford College in 1978 and his MA, MPhil, and PhD from Columbia University in 1987. Since 1988, he has been head of post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy in northwestern Turkey, and English language editor of Studia Troika, an annual journal of the Troy excavations, of which 18 volumes have appeared. He's recently completed the final publication of the architecture and architectural decoration of the Roman houses at Troy, as well as the final publication of the Temple of Athena. Between 2003 and 2007, he directed the Granicus River Valley Survey Project, which focused on recording and mapping the Greco-Persian tombs that dominate northwestern Turkey. He is co-director of the Gordian Excavation Project in central Turkey, where the University of Pennsylvania has been conducting fieldwork since the 1950s. His research has also concentrated on the political and artistic relationship between Rome and the provinces, notably in the book Dynastic Commemoration and Imperial Portraiture in the Julio-Claudian period. He's received so many fellowships that I'm not going to list them, but you can take my word for it that they're the best ones. He's also a member of the board of directors of the American Research Institute in Turkey, a trustee of the American Academy in Rome, a member of the board of directors of the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. Between 1994 and 2000, he was an academic trustee of the Archaeological Institute of America, then first vice president in 2002 to 2006, and president from 2007 to 11. It is about his work in that role that we will hear today, and this is work that he continues. And we are, I think, collectively in his debt for the leadership and courage that he has demonstrated in spaces of conflict, and for the way he has shown us through his example that higher education is not a thing that you hang on the wall, but rather a toolbox that you take into the world and use as needed. There is a character in Nick Hornby's novel, High Fidelity, who compulsively makes top 5 lists. If I were to make a top 5 list of people alongside whom I feel privileged to work, Brian Rose would be right there at the top of it. And I have tremendous respect for what he does. So please join me in welcoming Brian Rose.
Okay, thank you. Could we have the lights out, Sarah? Thank you in particular, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. I hated to see it stop, but I'm delighted to have this chance. It's really an honor for me to have this opportunity to speak to you tonight about archaeology and war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is very much an autobiographical talk, more so than most of the talks I give, because it's, in a sense, a chronicle of my interaction with archaeology, with war, and with violence over the course of the last 10 years in ways I never would have dreamt that I ever would have encountered. The discipline of archaeology has been impacted in a major way by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the course of the last 10 years. Before 2003, if you were to have looked at conference titles in archaeology, you might have seen something like archaeology of pastoralism, archaeology of nomadism, archaeology of gender, archaeology of food. And then came 2003, and everything changed in terms of the kinds of conferences that one saw in archaeology. And I've only put down a few titles here, but you'll get the gist of it. Archaeology of war, of destruction, of conflict, of trauma, of violence, of battle, of mass graves, on and on and on. Even now, if you look at the lists of conferences in archaeology that are being held, you see these themes expressed over and over again. You see it, in fact, throughout the humanities. I mean, the Penn Humanities Forum is a case in point. The theme this year, of course, is violence. And coupled with that, there's been an attempt to view the modern world in ancient terms. So to identify who we are as a people now within the context of antiquity, especially ancient wars. So it's no longer uncommon to see gruesome images like this. I'm showing you at the left a scene from the Column of Trajan in central Rome, which was constructed in the early 2nd century AD, showing Roman soldiers, as you see here, holding the severed heads of their enemies, Dacians, residents of ancient Romania, following the war. So they have severed the heads of their enemies, and they're showing the severed heads to the emperor as if they were war trophies, which is very much the way in which they were regarded. This is often shown with images of the Taliban, which would sever the heads of their enemies and show them to the TV cameras as war trophies in the same sense. And so in many contexts, you'll see these two images presented together as a way of asking students in our classes the question, have we changed in 2,000 years? These images are 2,000 years apart, and yet they're essentially the same thing. Even the gestures that you see on the left and the right are more or less identical. This has led writers and scholars to ask a number of questions. In light of the similarities between who we are now as a people and what we're doing, especially in the field of battle, are we any different from what the Romans were doing 2,000 years ago? So a famous book, of course, appeared several years ago by Cullen Murphy, Are We Rome?, where he compared what the Romans were doing, especially their attitudes toward expansion, conflict, and the waging of war, with what America was doing during the period in which George Bush was president. This, in turn, had a counter-reaction, sort of like Reformation and counter-Reformation, why America is not a new Rome. And you'll find people lining up on either side of the line. But what's interesting is that we're defining ourselves in terms or in the context of ancient empires, which at least for me as an academic is something new. It's not just Rome that we're using as a template in which to view ourselves, but also Troy, the mound of which you see on the right, and where I've had the good fortune of excavating for 25 years. So the Trojan War and Troy itself has been cited more and more frequently in academic discourse than at any other time since perhaps the Trojan War itself, 3,000 years ago. And even if you look at the main image used for the pamphlet for the Penn Humanities Forum this year, this is what you'll see, Cy Twombly's 50 Days at Ilion, which, of course, hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's not surprising that Troy would be so influential in humanities dialogues or in discussions where we're trying to understand our own actions, because, of course, Homer's epic was not really about winners and losers. It was about emotions. It was about love and hate and fury and grief and the emotional strength and fragility that accompany all of them. So in a sense, it's a perfect template to use in understanding the wars in which we currently find ourselves engaged. And you see this in a lot of literature where there's been a link between America's wars and Homeric heroes. So a case in point is Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam, as well as his follow-up book, Odysseus in America, where either we put ourselves in the Trojan War with the Homeric heroes, or we put the Homeric heroes in the modern wars that we're currently waging. And you see the same thing with the play by Ellen McLaughlin, Ajax in Iraq. And you see it also in a rather new spectacle that is being staged all over the country. It's actually occurred in this very auditorium a couple years ago, Theater of War, where what you would see is a presentation of Sophocles' Ajax, whom you see here, of course, in a late 6th century BC vase painting. Ajax, of course, one of the Homeric heroes who lost his mind during the war and subsequently committed suicide. And what we see in this spectacle, which has the moniker Theater of War, is the reading of Sophocles' Ajax, the performance of Sophocles' Ajax, coupled with interviews, testimony, comments with the veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where ancient trauma is placed side by side with modern war trauma. It's a way of destigmatizing the trauma, in a sense, by, I guess, using classical drama as psychological field dressing, in a sense. And it even convinced the Pentagon to invest $3.7 million in the link between antiquity and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that this program represents. And so you'll find it performed all over the country. The link between war and archaeology, the modern wars and archaeology, were most strongly felt, I suppose, beginning in 2003 when the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. But the destruction at ancient sites and museums in Iraq and Afghanistan had been going on for a very long time, really for the last 20 years. So one can take it back, of course, to the first Gulf War at the beginning of the 1990s. Although we didn't realize it at the time, at least I didn't realize it at the time, that's when the wide-scale looting of archaeological sites began. And you're seeing one of the textbook examples of looting at an archaeological site in Iraq. This is southern Iraq, the site of Zabalam, an early, a 3rd millennium BC site, where you'll see the buildings that have been excavated by the archaeologists, and then the pits dug by the looters, almost like craters of the moon, wherein people would dig down trying to find something of value that they could then sell on the art market and earn a few dollars. So we witnessed the wide-scale plundering of archaeological sites beginning in the 1990s. We tend to think that this started in 2003, but once I started going to Iraq, it became clear to me as I spoke to the residents what had happened, that after the first Gulf War, with the imposition of sanctions, what those sanctions did was to put the middle class out of business. So the small businesses that they owned were suddenly defunct. They needed to find a different revenue stream in order to feed their families. And so many of them turned to looting as the easiest way to secure some funding very quickly, or some money very quickly. And so that was the beginning of the looting. And at the same time, Afghanistan was crumbling. This is a shot from 1994, right after one of the rockets used in the Civil War in Afghanistan had hit the museum. So a lot of the pottery was destroyed. A number of the coins were stolen and melted down. As you all know, the story of the museums, the Afghanistan museum's looting is legend. We lost so much at that point in time. And archaeological organizations at this time really did very little. You know, we should have seen it, and we didn't. So when the rocket hit the museum in Afghanistan, I mean, you can look at the museum's Expedition magazine. What did we say? We really didn't say anything. There was almost a feeling that this wasn't about us. We dug in other countries that weren't at war, and this wasn't something with which we needed to be involved. By the same token, as these archaeological sites in Iraq were looted in the course of the 1990s, you look at the popular archaeological magazines, it wasn't that we didn't note that it was happening, but we didn't really do anything. There seems to have been a feeling that this wasn't our job to do anything to try to stop this cultural heritage destruction. And it didn't really change until 2003, when the Iraq Museum was looted. And of course, there were a lot of different estimates as to how many of the antiquities were taken at that point. The early estimates reached as high as 150,000. We now would regard about 15,000 objects as having been stolen from the Iraq Museum, and about 7,500 of them, about 50%, have been recovered. So we're still missing many objects, but only one of the most important objects that were stolen. Still, it was almost like a death in the family, and you see that with the former director, recently deceased director of the Iraq Museum, Donnie George, who's mourning the destruction of his museum, where so much cultural property was destroyed. And at this point, it was clear that we had to respond. The question was how to respond, and no one really had an answer. And here, too, we didn't behave very well as a discipline. Archaeologists, at least to my mind, didn't behave very well. I put myself in this category. We all wanted, every archaeological organization wanted to find the answer. How could we protect the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan? And so rather than joining together in a group and establishing strategic partnerships, we all built walls between the archaeological organizations, each one hoping that they would find the solution to the problem and that they would get the glory that stemmed from the discovery of that solution. So in short, we didn't do very well, and no one was sure what to do, really. There weren't a lot of productive avenues of movement that were posited at that point. We had never dealt with anything like this before. We couldn't go to Iraq and Afghanistan. The army was in Iraq, the army was in Afghanistan. These were areas to which we couldn't go. This was 2003, and they were very much at war. And this was the point at which I became president-elect of the AIA, of the Archaeological Institute of America. And so these concerns were now brought to me for the first time in my life. You have to do something. And the president at that point of the AIA, Jane Waldbaum, said, you have to staff the war desk and figure out how to protect the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I said, you don't understand. I went to a Quaker college. I have no idea how to go about this. And she said, we'll figure it out, because I've got other things to do and we have to respond. So what I quickly realized was that we couldn't figure it out ourselves, nor should we try it. We needed to bring, if we could, archaeologists from Iraq and from Afghanistan to the US or to somewhere where we could talk to them and find out what suggestions they could make to us as to how the situation could be ameliorated. And so, it's situations like this that give you courage. And you realize that if someone says no, that's not the worst thing in the world. So I thought, all right, I will bring the head of the Afghanistan Antiquities Department to our next AIA annual meeting in San Francisco. This was Abdulwasi Firuzi. And I'll bring Donnie George from Baghdad. And I'll ask them what we can do that will make a difference. How can we be most potentially productive? And then I thought, gee, I need some money to do that. So out of the blue, I don't know where I found the courage, but out of the blue, I called up David Packard in Palo Alto from Packard Humanities and Hewlett Packard, from the head of the Packard Humanities Institute. I called him out of the blue and he picked up the phone, and I said, David, I need $25,000. And he said, okay. And I thought, this isn't so hard. And that money came within a week. So then I had to deal with the UN to get Abdulwasi Firuzi out of Afghanistan, because there were not exactly commercial flights at that point. It was 2003, after all. And Donnie George wasn't able to come at all because his superior was killed just before the meetings. And so he had to stay there. And so there was someone else from Iraq who had to come in his stead. But during this meeting, Abdulwasi Firuzi said to me, you've got to find a way to let the soldiers who are deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan know something about what they're guarding and why it's important to guard it. So they know nothing, they're being told nothing about the archaeology of Iraq and Afghanistan, about the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan by the Department of Defense and pre-deployment training. And so, he didn't exactly say that, but he said they have no idea what they're guarding. And therefore, we in Iraq and Afghanistan have the sense that they're not guarding the museums, the libraries, the archaeological sites with as much fervor as they should be showing, with as much attention as these monuments, these institutions deserve. And so you need to find a way to deal with that. If you can do that, that will have made a contribution. And so I thought, well, then I'll just start a lecture program where we archaeologists go to military bases throughout the US, and if they'll let us, Iraq and Afghanistan, and teach the soldiers about cultural heritage protection and what's important about the culture of Iraq and Afghanistan. What do archaeologists know how to do? Two things, teach and dig. That's all we can do. So I thought, at least we can teach. We can't dig, nor should we, but at least we can teach them how to work. And then I thought, how do I do this? That led me to investigate earlier connections between academics and the military. And of course, if you go back to World War II, there was a very strong connection between academia and the military in the form of the monuments men, or we should really say monuments officers, because of course they were both men and women. But with the monuments men at the end of World War II, you of course had art historians, archaeologists, classicists, historians, humanists in general, who worked hand in hand with the US Armed Forces, with the Allied forces, to find, conserve, and repatriate works of art and antiquities that had been stolen by the Nazis. And you see one example here. This is in Neuschwanstein Castle in 1945 with a group directed by James Rorimer, who would later, of course, be director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So at the end of World War II, there was a very strong cultural connection between the military and academia. And then in the Korean War, it seems to have fallen apart. No one in the Korean War seems to have been concerned about the protection of cultural heritage, at least from what I can gather. And then it was completely demolished in the Vietnam War, where academics weren't working with the military, they were actively marching against them. So at this point, in the late 60s and early 70s, the military began to view academics, such as many of us, as the enemy, just as much an enemy as the Vietnamese whom they were fighting. And academics felt the same way. So when I began to consider how I could launch this program, I realized I didn't have any foundation on which I could build. I had what I knew from the monuments men, but that had been a very long time ago. That had been 60 years earlier. And I didn't see any way in which I could effect a link again between the two enterprises, between the military and academia. I remembered that I had gone to graduate school at Columbia, with Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who was a Marine Corps colonel, recently retired, and we didn't know each other well, but I knew him, and he had been placed in charge of repatriating the antiquities that had been stolen from the Iraq Museum in 2003. So he was in the Army, he was in the Marines, he was obviously concerned about the protection of cultural heritage, and he was very creative in determining how to get the artifacts that had been looted from the museum back in the museum, having established a link with the clerics in the mosques in Baghdad. So establishing a strategic partnership with the mosques wherein if you had stolen antiquities and you returned them to the mosque within a specified period of time, there would be no questions asked and there would be no punishment that would be levied on you. It would all be anonymous, and the antiquities would then be repatriated to the museum, and you could move on. If you didn't repatriate after a certain point, then you would be prosecuted. And this worked extraordinarily well. A lot of people brought their antiquities to the mosques. The clerics asked no questions of them. Nothing was written down. The antiquities were simply repatriated to the museum. And so you see, of course, one of the more prominent examples here, the so-called Warka vase, as it came back to the museum in an ice chest, and as it looked immediately prior to the looting of the museum. And then you see other objects repatriated that were put on display for the people of Baghdad following the conclusion of the program. So I spoke to Matthew I called him out of the blue. I mean, I hadn't spoken to him in 25 years. So I found someone, a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, had his home phone number. So I called him. I thought, this worked with David Packard, maybe it'll work with Matthew Bogdanos. So I called him and I said, hi, we haven't seen each other since that party in 1982. Here's what I want to do. I want to start a troops lecture program for archaeologists to go to military bases. And I thought I could do it with no help at all because I had written a letter to Donald Rumsfeld saying, I want to start, right, someone laughed. Indeed, that was a justifiable laugh. I had written a letter to Donald Rumsfeld saying, I want to start this lecture program. What do you think of that? Of course, he never answered. Still to this day, he has not answered me. And he never will. So I said to Matthew, I wrote to Donald Rumsfeld, and then he laughed, just as you have, and said, Donald Rumsfeld is not going to answer your letter, and you don't want to write to him. You want to write to General Abizade at the U.S. Central Command in Florida, and I'll help shepherd the program through the hurdles, as he did. And so 9 months after I had proposed the program, it was approved by General Abizade, and we were in a position where I could actually start to do it. And so I started with the Marines in Camp Lejeune, and then expanded it to the Army in Fort Bliss, and then the Air Force at Fort Dix, where I still do the training. And initially, there was great hesitation about us coming into the bases. And going into the bases was hard enough. Just because I had the approval of General Abizade to send archaeologists to the military bases, that didn't mean that the base commanders were okay with it. So there was another stratum of authority with which I had to deal before I was able to get it done. And this was the first lecture that I did at Camp Lejeune in 2004. So I'm wearing tweed, which is what our people wear, and they're wearing military fatigues. And the officers asked me to give them the lecture first, because how did they know I wasn't a latter-day Jane Fonda who was going to preach to the troops that they should get out of Iraq and Afghanistan? I had emphasized that the program that we were going to embark upon would be politically neutral, but there was no way, they didn't know me from Adam, there was no way they could be sure that it would, in fact, be politically neutral. So I gave it to the officers first. Overnight, they had carpeted and painted the room with new pictures hung. They were pictures of combat, but nevertheless, they were new. And I said at Penn it would take 6 months in order for me to get a room carpeted and repainted. And they said, we're the Marines. We can do anything. So the officers approved it, and I was able to begin the program. And most of the programs I did at military bases in the States, although on occasion I went to Iraq and Afghanistan and did it there. It was easier said than done to start this program. It wasn't just that I had to convince the military, I also had to convince other archaeologists that this was a good thing to do, because there were a number of archaeologists, really quite a number, who said you mustn't establish a partnership with the military. They're the enemy. Remember the Vietnam War? You mustn't do this. And I said, how else can we protect cultural heritage? I can't see any other way. there was a strong push for the AIA to take sides in the war. And I emphasize that it's not the job of the AIA or any archaeological institute or enterprise to take sides in a war, only to take sides regarding the rights of the antiquities that are threatened by war or threatened by armed conflict. And I was able to launch the program without earning the condemnation of my colleagues, but there were many who wrote articles condemning the program and saying that we were no better than the invaders in doing this. And that's something that we can talk about more during the question and answer session a little later. This was my first trip to Iraq right after I had landed in Baghdad. We were about to fly to southern Iraq where I was going to do some lectures, and I always refer to this as my Michael Dukakis in the tank photograph, because if ever there was someone who wasn't born to wear body armor, it would be me. And I'm standing, by the way, I should identify the other people. This is Diane Seabrandt, the Cultural Heritage Liaison at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and Laurie Rush, the archaeologist at Fort Drum, who's been very much my partner in crime throughout these programs, and whose name you'll hear subsequently as I go through the lecture. What was difficult initially was conveying everything I wanted to convey to them in the time that I had to convey it. So there were times when they would say, I'd get to the base and they would say, you have 20 minutes. And I said, 20 minutes? I have to teach them the archaeology and history of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the fundamentals of historic preservation. I have to teach them how to handle monumental mud brick architecture, which, if it's not handled correctly, can look like melted ice cream. And of course, in southern Iraq and in Afghanistan, the primary type of architecture that you find is mud brick. I have to tell them how to respond if they enter a museum that's just been hit by a rocket, what to do, what not to do, how to liaise with the local community. These are things that can take years to convey. I can't do it in 20 minutes. And they said, you have 20 minutes. So this was something that I also had to learn, that going to a military base is not like going out on a lecture program. We're used to lecture series where people treat us like gods. You know, those of you who are academics in the room will know what I mean. You go to a lecture venue, you're treated to an elaborate dinner. Sometimes it's at 5 o'clock, but okay. And then you're put up in a nice hotel overnight. Sometimes the children in the audience will ask for your autograph. It's a lovely experience. The military isn't like that. They will tell you that you have to give a lecture to 500 people in 5 minutes, suicide prevention. But I wasn't reaching them to the extent that I needed to. I needed to make them care as much about the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan as I did, as any archaeologist would. And what I noticed was that after the initial lectures, there would always be 1 or 2 or 3 or sometimes 5 soldiers who would say, is this the Garden of Eden? Where's the Garden of Eden? Direct me to the Garden of Eden. And I said, okay, well, I'd like to keep what we're doing separate from religious issues. And then I realized, what do they know about Iraq? They know the Garden of Eden. They know Daniel in the lion's den. They know Noah's flood. They know biblical episodes from the book of Genesis. So I need to keep a line between archaeology and religion. But if I focus on topics that are referenced in the Bible, and I talk about recent archaeological discoveries that have been linked by some to biblical episodes, maybe that will make a difference. So I didn't restrict myself anymore to Iraq. I started talking about places like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which you see here, a wonderful early Neolithic site dating to about 9,000 BC with our earliest stone relief sculpture, the beginning of the Neolithic period. And this is between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It's an advanced civilization, clearly, earlier than we would have thought possible. And the bones and the seeds that have been found there indicate that it's also the beginning of domesticated crops and domesticated animals. And so the city fathers of Göbekli Tepe are selling it as the Garden of Eden because it's between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. It's an advanced civilization. And in the story of the Garden of Eden, they're gathering at the beginning, they pick that apple, and they're farming by the end of the story. And so, again, the city fathers of Göbekli Tepe have said, well, the archaeology, in essence, presents that same picture. So we're going to put up signs saying, now entering the Garden of Eden. Now, of course, it's not the Garden of Eden. But once I started referencing episodes in the Bible and recent archaeological attempts or recent archaeological discoveries that have been linked to such, I realized they were looking at me in a different way. The same with the flood, and you're seeing, of course, our flood tablet from Nippur. Of course, there are flood stories in so many different ancient civilizations where the gods sent a flood to punish the wickedness of humankind. And recent archaeological investigations in the Black Sea have shown that the Black Sea was originally a freshwater lake, and then around 5,500 BC, the waters of the Mediterranean and the Aegean pushed through what is now northwestern Turkey, so right here, turning it from a freshwater lake to a saltwater lake and causing flooding as a consequence. Now, is this the story that gives rise to so many myths or legends about a flood sent by the gods to punish humankind? Probably not. There were floods all the time in the ancient Near East. But again, this is one of those stories that I could bring up that I thought captured their interest in a better way than I had been able to do before. With Laurie Rush, I developed these playing cards that are used to reinforce the lessons that we give them in the cultural heritage training programs. And so you see some of them here. Purchasing ancient souvenirs, buying ancient artifacts helps fund the insurgents who are trying to kill you. Do not buy antiquities. Or how would we feel if someone destroyed the torch of the Statue of Liberty? If we experienced a major cultural property loss, obviously we'd feel terrible. And I wanted them to get a sense of what the residents of Iraq and Afghanistan feel when their cultural heritage is destroyed. Recently, we're on slightly better ground, slightly safer ground in terms of limiting the black market trade in antiquities, courtesy of the International Council of Museums, which publishes a special pamphlet or book called the Red List when there are areas where antiquities are being plundered right and left. And so you see some of the recent ones here. Egypt, obviously, this was necessary after the Civil War, which of course is still in a sense ongoing, Syria, and Colombia. These don't showcase the objects that have been stolen, but they highlight the objects that are similar to those that have been stolen. And that is something that we can give to customs agents to limit the trade in antiquities and to stop them as they begin to move across borders. The plundering of archaeological sites isn't, of course, limited to zones of conflict. What we see is a better financed antiquities thievery than ever before. This is just one case in point, which showcases a new feature of looting called looting to order, or what I call looting to order. This is a tomb excavated by Bryn Mawr College in southwestern Turkey in the late 1960s and early 1970s called Karaburun. You see the paintings here as they were found, dating to 470 BC, and then after they were taken from the wall. This happened 2 years ago. So the thieves went in with conservators and simply lifted the paintings from the wall. Now, these are famous paintings. You could never send them to Sotheby's and Christie's for them to be sold. They would be seized instantly. But that means that it was probably a theft to order. Someone commissioned the theft of these paintings and now has them in his or her basement where they will be accessible to a small group of their friends, and perhaps in 2 generations they'll make their way to center stage again and we'll know what happened to them. But right now, it's simply gone. We're seeing this happen more and more frequently as the plundering industry becomes more and more popular and better financed. No matter what happens to the world economy, antiquities always rise in value, and this is a byproduct of that. What we've seen also in the wake of all of this loss of cultural property is an attempt on the part of many nations to try to seek their antiquities that have been stolen from their soil. And in many cases, museums like the Metropolitan or the Getty have been sued by countries like Italy, Greece, or Turkey, and they have agreed to repatriate the antiquities that they had bought from the art market. A case in point, of course, is the repatriation of the famous Euphronius vase in 2008, a late 6th century BC vase by one of the great Greek vase painters that had been bought by the Met in the early 1970s and then repatriated to Italy in 2008. And when these antiquities come home, they're treated as Homeric heroes who have had complex and dangerous wanderings before they've returned to the place from which they had originally come. And so this is an exhibition catalog highlighting the antiquities that have been returned, and the antiquities are called nostoi. That's Homer's word for the wandering Homeric heroes who returned home after the Trojan War, but only after having experienced a variety of delays and dangers. So again, you find the Homeric hero metaphor that's being applied to elements. In some cases, the antiquities now speak in first person. So if you look at blogs that are put up in large part by the residents of Greece, they relate to the Parthenon sculptures, the Elgin marbles, that of course were sold by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. The Sultan, of course, at that point had jurisdiction over this region because Greece was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and they went to the British Museum. And now Greece wants them returned. So you will see the antiquity speaking in first person suddenly. This is a new development. I've never quite witnessed this before, but it's a development that I'll come back to in a minute. And we've also seen, in connection with this, a rise in nationalism in so many different areas where the antiquities are a fundamental component of that nationalism. So these are just two examples. The demonstrations against Yale University in 2010, in Peru, urging Yale to return the antiquities from Machu Picchu that had been taken at the beginning or toward the beginning of the 20th century. And so you can read all of the signs. Yale, give us back our cultural property. By the same token, at the time of the Civil War in 2011 in Cairo, there were curators and other residents of Cairo who formed a human chain around the Cairo Archaeological Museum to prevent what happened in Iraq from happening there as well. This nationalism, which is so closely connected with cultural property, is something that we see all over the world, really. We tend to think it happens in Central America or in the Mediterranean or in the Near East, but we've got it too. If you look at the celebrations in America on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, how big did the flags get? They were so big people couldn't carry them anymore. So as you see in this particular case, this is an event more or less at the same time as the demonstrations in Peru. So nationalism is a worldwide phenomenon now, really becoming more and more prominent as the years go by, and the repercussions for cultural property protection are significant. You see it also in some countries that have rallied around ancient heroes. So they've chosen to define themselves by linking their identities to ancient heroes who were around at a time before the current religious traditions were in operation. So you look at the 25,000 dinar note in Iraq, and you see Hammurabi and Shamash as the primary image. So going back before the advent of Islam and finding a major historical character around whom the residents, regardless of what sect of Islam they belong to, can rally. And a more extreme example you can see in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, where virtually everything has been named after Alexander the Great. The airport, the stores, and a colossal statue of Alexander on Bucephalus that's been erected in the center of the capital of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Skopje. One of the things we've seen in connection with these claims for cultural property repatriation are threats by the countries that have been plundered directed toward other countries and other museums, saying, if you want to conduct research in my country, you'll give us back the antiquities, or else you're going to have a fight on your hands. So fights, war, violence, this is something that doesn't just occur on the ground. There's been very much an intellectual war that's developed between museums in one country and another, or between ministries of culture in the Near East and the Mediterranean, in particular, vis-a-vis Western nations such as Italy, France, England, and of course the US. This has given rise to other questions. It's not just, are we Rome? It's who owns antiquity? Are we justified in having these restrictive cultural property laws, or should we have a more relaxed attitude toward the trade in antiquities? And this, of course, is one of the more famous examples of that question. The book written by Jim Cuno, which again we can discuss during the question and answer session. What Jim Cuno and others would argue is that in some countries, the antiquities aren't safe staying there. And they will point to Afghanistan, where, of course, in 2001, the Taliban tied dynamite to the shoulders and ankles of the colossal Buddhas This was 170 feet high, 53 meters high, and destroyed them so that now all you see is a shell, whereas there had once been a full-scale statue created in the 6th century AD. So given what the Taliban did, are we justified in having these restricted laws? Because the government in control of the country might cause more damage to the antiquities than the trade in antiquities. And these are questions that are still being addressed. By the same token, we see iconoclasm, the destruction of images, sometimes the violent destruction of images, being dominant in so many different areas, really all over the world. And this, too, is something that you can trace back to antiquity. Iconoclasm is something that goes back at least as early as the early 3rd millennium BC in Egypt. And you see it, of course, all over Persia with giant monuments that are carved in the cliffs of the hillsides and with statements. This one made by the Persian king Darius saying, "I went after those who had rebelled against me. I cut off their nose and ears and tongues. I put out their eyes. And then I did it again, and then I did it again, and then I did it again." So the defacement of the face, the disfiguration of the face of the enemy. And of course, this was done with sculptures too, in the same area. This is the famous bronze head, allegedly, of Sargon, the king of the Akkadian Empire. And at some point in antiquity, the eye was gouged out, the ears were cut off, and the nose was hammered off, just as you see in the expressions of Darius on the rock-cut monuments. And we see this with the dictator statues, the so-called dictator statues, all over the world, this acceleration of iconoclasm. Of course, we've seen it with the destruction of the images of Saddam Hussein, and you can go as far as the Philippines if you want and see the colossal image of Ferdinand Marcos, 100 feet high, that was carved in one of the cliffs of the Philippines, just like Mount Rushmore, that was subsequently destroyed, especially the orbital region was destroyed by dynamite 20 years after it had been made. This, too, is a standard feature of iconoclasm these days. You blindfold the statue before you destroy it, or you simply blow out the eyes. So you can see before the statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down, they had hooded him. Before the statue of Stalin in Moscow was pulled down, they blindfolded it, and then they just blow out the eyes of Ferdinand Marcos. Sometimes it's difficult for us to know what cultural property should be protected. In the case of something like the Bamiyan Buddhas, we know what should be protected. That clearly is a great monument of religious history and of art. But what about those dictator statues? Should they be protected? Should they go to a museum? Or is it okay that they're blown up? And I dealt with this when I was in southern Iraq at the site of Ur with the House of Abraham. The archaeological site supervisor of Nasiriyah, Abdulamir Hamdani, is here with me and Diane Seabrant from the embassy in Baghdad. And he said, we're going to tear down the House of Abraham in Ur, which is allegedly where Abraham lived. And we're going to tear it down because it was set up by Saddam Hussein in 1999 to encourage the Pope to come to Iraq for the Jubilee year, the Vatican's Jubilee year of 2000, because the Pope had announced that he would go on biblical pilgrimages. And so from scratch, it seems, Saddam Hussein built a 40-room house of Abraham. Now, Abraham, if he did live in Iraq, in Ur, probably lived in a mud brick hut, wood at best, but not a 40-room mansion. That's the kind of place where Saddam Hussein lived. But in any event, it's an archaeological site that's been manipulated to a political end. So archaeology as propaganda. And that's the point Abdulamir was making. This is archaeology in the service of propaganda of a disgraced ruler, and we want to see it destroyed. And I said, don't destroy it. You see me saying that right here. Don't destroy it. It's part of the history of the archaeological site. So if you find that it's been used to incite violence or hatred or bigotry or whatever, then put up a sign that says that. But don't destroy it. Don't erase it. That will solve nothing. And you can tell from his body language how he responded to that appeal. He said, I want it destroyed. And although it still stands. The day before my last day in Afghanistan 2 years ago, I was in Ghazni in the south, again lecturing. The day before my last day was the day when the minister in Florida burned the Quran. You see him here at the left. And of course, this was on the internet, the actual burning of the book. And that reached Afghanistan my last day. And of course, there were riots all over the country. A lot of people died, some from the UN, and a number of Afghans died in the riots that subsequently occurred. And I realized that our definition of cultural property isn't significantly large. This is cultural property. Destroying this falls into the same sphere as the dynamiting of the Buddhas by the Taliban. And I realized that those of us who are academics in the humanities, it's very easy to just stay in a university environment and teach to bright students on the university and the graduate level. But we really need to increase our outreach. We really need, in particular, to go after the children, or to go after the teachers who are spending time with the children, to get them to learn respect for all types of cultural property before they've learned to be intolerant of different races and different types of cultural property. In a sense, things are getting better. The Army is now more aware of the need of protecting cultural property, so there are actually imitation Afghan cemeteries on some military bases where the troops actually have to practice before deploying so that they're more sensitive to the protection of the types of cultural property or the types of buildings that they'll encounter. We, of course, still train as many soldiers as we can. You see some of them from Fort Dix here at the Penn Museum. But what we hope is that at some point the Department of Defense will make cultural heritage training a mandatory part of pre-deployment training, which it currently is not. The fact that the US has ratified the Hague Convention, which they did in 2008, gives us a lot of hope that eventually the Department of Defense may move in this direction, but they haven't yet. What we also are doing now is establishing more strategic partnerships. We're no longer like the Tower of Babel that we were in 2003. So we're trying to become a kind of United Nations of archaeologists. So the AIA has signed agreements with the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the German Archaeological Institute, a whole variety of archaeological institutes, so that we can speak with one voice when cultural property is threatened again. I mentioned outreach before, and that's the last point I want to leave you with before I end this lecture, because it's very easy for us to forget the importance of outreach. And what I'm showing you here is an image that ties into that lesson of outreach. This is the entrance to the Afghanistan Museum, the Kabul Archaeological Museum, in 2001, right after the Taliban were pushed out of the area. And at that point, they set up a sign, a bilingual sign above the entrance, saying a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And that's now been immortalized in stone right next to the entrance of the Archaeological Museum. And this is really something that all of us have to keep in mind, whether you're a member of the Penn Humanities Forum or a student at the university or a member of the museum or just someone who wandered in this room by mistake. I can't overemphasize the importance of keeping the idea of cultural property protection in mind in the course of your conversations with every stratum of society, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to ensure that cultural heritage stays alive and thus the nations associated with those cultures. So thank you in advance for doing that, and thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you. Okay, so we've obviously covered a wide variety of viewpoints, and there are particular issues that I raised that I didn't tie up in a nice little package because I wanted us to be able to discuss them, and also because, as I've increasingly realized in the course of the last 10 years, many of these issues are not black and white, they are gray, and one has to remain flexible in one's thinking if one is to find a way forward. One also has to be willing to compromise, as you see I've tried to do in the course of the last 10 years and in the course of developing this program. So I think at this point we have those who want to ask questions or who want to hear the questions still remaining behind, so we can open the floor to those questions. Since this is being videotaped, I would ask that you refrain from asking a question until this traveling mic reaches your hand. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and the traveling mic will make its way toward you. Yes, the first one. You can just take your pick, Kate.
Thank you. So I know you touched on the rising charges of repatriation in response to the everything going on with the Iraq artifacts, and I know that ICOM has previously made what seems to be, to me, non-academic or perhaps just non-nationalistic stand on repatriation. I'm sure you're familiar with that, and what do you think about that as an academic and a museum professional there?
Well, the repatriation issue is a hard one because just as we grow accustomed to the rules, they change under our feet. So some in the room will know my experience with this particular issue, but you may not. So this is a story that will ultimately answer your question, and I'll try to keep it brief. This museum doesn't buy any antiquities from the art market. We haven't bought any antiquities from the art market since 1970. We established what we call the Pennsylvania Declaration in 1970, where we announced that, to the world that we would no longer buy antiquities unless they had a legality of export, a certificate of legality of export, and a known archaeological context or provenance. 4 years before that time, in 1966, the museum bought a hoard of early Bronze Age gold jewelry, very similar in style to the gold assemblage that Heinrich Schliemann found at Troy in 1873. And no one claimed repatriation of those antiquities at the time of purchase in 1966. In 2009, I brought one of my colleagues from Troy to the museum to examine that assemblage because it was in my care at that point. It was in the Mediterranean section. He found in one of the pendants a grain of sand with extraordinarily high levels of arsenic in that sand, which were of the same high levels of arsenic as one could find in the sand of the soil of Troy. That was a kind of smoking gun. And so shortly thereafter, Turkey asked us to repatriate the so-called Trojan gold. At the time, I said to Turkey, this was bought by the museum in 1966, so 4 years before the UNESCO convention, 4 years before 1970, that we had all thought was the line in the sand, and which the International Council of Museums would agree with. And they said, we're no longer following the 1970 line in the sand. We've established a new line in the sand in 1906. That's the Ottoman Antiquities Law that we passed in 1906. Right after that, they claimed a statue from the Pergamon Museum in Berlin that reached there in 1905. To my mind, it's only a question of time before we move into the 19th century with the request for repatriation of objects. Once we move into the 19th century, it gets a lot messier because so many borders changed in the course of the 19th century, and even more had changed in the 18th century. So how do we handle the issue of repatriation? If we had a firm line in the sand, if we could adhere to 1970, I'd feel more comfortable dealing with it. But we haven't seen the end of these lines in the sand. There are no more lines in the sand. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So we're no longer sure how to respond. Each case is different. In our case, what we did was to send the gold to Turkey on indefinite loan with the understanding that we would never see it again. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't our decision. The museum didn't own it. The trustees of the University of Pennsylvania own it. So we had to convince Amy Gutman of a solution, and we had to convince the Ministry of Culture and Tourism in Ankara of a solution. We had to bring them to the same table. And that was the best compromise that we could reach. And of course, we're getting material from Turkey on long-term loan as a consequence of that agreement. So we try to be strategic in our planning, but we're entering a very gray area where the one line in the sand that we thought we could rely on in terms of repatriation efforts is no longer there. So each case is different. Kate, we've got a question down here.
Follow-up question, and it might be blasphemous, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It seems to me that you could make very good copies, for instance, of the Trojan gold. And if the purpose of the museum, if it is, and I don't know if it is, the purpose of the museum is to educate people, what would be so wrong about having a very beautiful copy that people could see, that they could learn from? and avoid all these arguments and fights.
But are you saying that we should have copied the gold before we repatriated it to Turkey, or Turkey should have taken the copies that we made and been content with that?
I'm going to leave that answer up to you.
It's hard to copy gold. Let me just start by saying that. You can't 3D scan gold and get a decent copy. We thought of that. In the end, it was that grain of sand on which a great deal of weight rested. They were able to argue that it had been plundered from their country in 1966, and so we had to send it back. What they said to me, they said two things to me. If this was a diamond ring that we had stolen from your great-grandmother in the 1950s, and you just found out we had it, wouldn't you ask for it back? It wouldn't be proper for us in Turkey to say, well, we stole it so long ago, we want to keep it. It's stolen property, you need to send it back. They also said, this is like NAGPRA for us. This is like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed by Congress. So this is our cultural heritage. And that's something that Jim Cuno would argue with. Because, of course, the residents of Turkey ultimately came from Central Asia. They weren't native to the Anatolian Peninsula, where they live now. Now, they would argue that the Trojans and the Turks are common people of Asia. That argument was advanced as far back as 1462 by Mehmet II when he went to Troy and said, Troy is the city of my kinsmen. The Turks claimed to be of Trojan descent, just like the Romans and the British and the French and the Danes and the Venetians and the Goths. So they would argue that it was all one thing and that the tie to the land was something they shared, and so they should have it. Now, as I said, there are no black and white solutions to this. These are gray areas, and you'll find a great deal of disagreement on this. In our case, Penn is the headquarters of the American Research Institute in Turkey. We've had a very profitable relationship with Turkey for over 60 years. So the notion that no one from Penn could research in Turkey anymore was, to me, unacceptable. And so I felt we needed to find the best compromise we could find, and that's what we ended up with. As you like. You have the microphone, so you can choose the questioner.
I was wondering, when you were in Iraq, I was actually deployed there, and I was in Mosul in northern Iraq with the Kurds a lot, and it appeared that they actually had, one thing I thought was like pretty interesting when I went there was actually just the whole like Rome thing too, was that a lot of the same, like the gates outside of Nineveh, that was bad for the Romans when they were there. When I was there, if you were there for more than 5 minutes, you're gonna get shot at or mortared. And for the weird, do you had any contacts with the Kurds, with them like being able to preserve their history? Because it looked like they had done a pretty good job of preserving a bunch of old Roman outposts in northern Iraq, and even we did like try and help with them out too, because even on we had a radio retransmission site on Sinjar, and we didn't use the tallest hill because that was actually sacred to the Yazidi Kurds there, and I was wondering if you had anything to do that before 2006 when I was there.
I never went to Kurdistan before 2006, but it's good that you bring up Kurdistan because they have been especially active in cultural heritage protection. So this is where you'll find now the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil, in the center of Kurdistan. This institute was developed with a grant from the Department of Defense, and the Mellon has given money, Cress has given money, World Monuments Fund has given money. A lot of money has gone into this. And what happens is primarily American conservators go there for 6 weeks or 2 months every year and train Iraqi conservators. So the notion is that what they will tell you in Afghanistan or in Iraq is that they're 30 years behind everybody else. I mean, in Afghanistan, the women kept saying to me, we've just had our own 30 years war. Think of the 17th century. That's what we have just gone through. So there's a need to go and train local conservators so that they can take care of their own monuments, because if we do, it would be shot. I mean, when I was in Ghazni and I was talking to some of the people in the town council about conserving an early 11th century minaret, I said, we can send conservators who can help you with this. And they said, no, you'll be killed. You can send conservators who can go somewhere to which we will send our conservators, and your conservators can train our conservators, and they can conserve it. And of course, they were absolutely right. So more and more of these institutes, I hope, will spring up, although of course they're incredibly expensive to operate. But the Kurds have made a major commitment to the preservation of the antiquities within their borders.
I did notice that. Thanks.
Okay. You'll be next.
Yes, I wonder, in your classes with the U.S. military people, they're taught to feel like people are, quote, enemies, right? I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, there's a sense where we're supposedly having a war on terrorists. So I wonder if they have a feeling about preserving those folks' culture, the very people that they're fighting against, supposedly. And I'm thinking of the, the statues that have been destroyed and so forth within a country.
But the destruction of the Buddhas was very much an exceptional development. In general, you find the people of Iraq and Afghanistan very focused on preserving their cultural heritage. Now, some of them are only thinking about eventual tourism, because they too were thinking about the biblical connection and pilgrimages, tourists coming to their areas and spending money because they want to see biblical sites. The soldiers to whom I speak are very much interested in winning the hearts and minds of the people with whom they interact, in my experience. And I tell them, if you want to win the hearts and minds of the people with whom you're interacting, you'll learn a few words in their language. So now there are language classes. They don't know a lot of words in Dari or in Pashto or in Arabic, but if they learn hello, thank you, good morning, good evening, that goes a long way. And if they can indicate that they know that that the Ghaznavid Empire in southern Afghanistan once dominated much of Central Asia in the 11th century, it means that that soldier has taken time out of his or her schedule to learn something about the history and the archaeology, the monuments of that particular region. And that too is a way of winning, or at least getting the attention of hearts and minds. And so the soldiers are very interested in that. Cultural heritage training was a long time coming for the Department of Defense. Early in my training, there was a woman who said, I need to know what I can expect to find as a woman in northern Afghanistan, and I need to know what my behavioral patterns should be in and around mosques. And I said, I'm an archaeologist. I'm not the kind of person to whom you should be posing these questions. And she said, you're all we have. There isn't anything else in cultural heritage training. Now there is, but that took years. Now there are classes, pre-deployment training sessions on gender, on gesture, on language, conversational language, as well as on cultural heritage, although not everywhere. But there's very much an interest on the part of the soldiers in behaving in the most proper way and winning the respect of the people with whom they're interacting in any way they can, in my experience. Kate, there's a question here.
When you could only have 20 minutes or an hour and a half to talk to the soldiers, how would you prioritize what to tell them? And what was your ranking of the important things to tell them?
When I only had 20 minutes, how did I do it? I would pick one example of something famous from Iraq that had a context. So the Royal Tombs of Ur, part of which is in this museum, legally, with the permission of the Republic of Iraq. And I would show them what you can learn about a civilization if the antiquities are found in context. And then I highlight how much information, how much history would have been lost if these objects had been found by looters. I do the same thing for Afghanistan. And then I go immediately into, so just two prominent examples from Iraq and Afghanistan and the importance of finding them in context. I want them to understand how much history is lost if the looters get there before we do and why they need to stop the looters if they're patrolling an archaeological site. Then I go into the fundamentals of historic preservation, do's and don'ts in mud brick architecture, and how to respond if they're entering a museum that's just been hit by a rocket. Now, some of them have seen action in Bosnia, where there were a lot of museums hit by rockets, and so they would help me. They would say, you said this, but I was in a situation that was a little different from that, and if I had done what you said, this would have been destroyed. And so just as often, I find comments, incredibly helpful comments from the men and women in the audience who have a whole different range of experiences than I do. So they're teaching me as much sometimes as I'm teaching them. Yes, a question in the back?
I want to return to the polemic about collaborating with the perpetrators and thinking a little bit about what that could mean for archaeology as a discipline and the potential backfire it can have with when places, if archaeological sites become targeted because of the association, the military association they can have. And the kind of what kind of strategies can be devised to work with groups that are not allied. For example, the case of Kurdistan is easier because there is an alliance with the U.S. Military. But what about other parts in Iraq and, for example, places in Syria right now? What kind of strategies have these different groups come up with as a conjunct international effort to think about long-term protection?
Yeah, you're asking a lot of very good questions, and I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. First of all, the targeting of archaeological sites. Those archaeological sites are targeted whether we're there or not. And this, too, was something that I learned in Iraq. When I was in southern Iraq, I went to an archaeological site called Larsa, which is a famous site of the second millennium BC. And when I was there, some of the locals said to me and to the other people with whom I was traveling, you can go here, but don't go over there because there are landmines. What happened was the Iraqi army assumed that the American army would go to archaeological sites in Iraq as tourists. And so they put a lot of landmines in the archaeological sites in order to blow up as many US soldiers as possible. And so I said, okay, I'll avoid that area. I'll just go over here. And of course, our handler said, everyone leaves immediately. And I said, well, the landmines are over here. Can't I go over here? And they said, are you an idiot? You're going to die. Get out of here. I was a little naive in Iraq the first time and the second time. But in terms of Syria, what is our long-term strategy for Syria? I wish I had a good answer for you. We don't have a long-term strategy for Syria. There's an institute in this museum, the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, overseen by Richard Leventhal. They're working on finding some solutions for the protection of cultural property in Syria, but we don't even know what's been destroyed. I mean, you get Twitter feeds, you get messages, emails from people saying this has been destroyed, but you don't know if you can trust the source. I've heard that Dura Europos, one of the great Roman caravan cities in eastern Syria, has been destroyed. Others have said that it's just fine. And some have said, well, a little has been destroyed, but not so much. So we don't know how much has been destroyed. And because it's such an ongoing civil war, it's just not clear what we can do. We don't have an answer for that. It's not that people aren't talking about it, and they're talking in strategic partnerships. This fragmenting of the archaeological community isn't happening any longer. But in Syria, we just don't know what to do. Maybe in 6 months, we will have made a little progress, but we haven't thus far. Keeping archaeological sites safe in the future, long-term maintenance of archaeological heritage on sites. You need to make the residents of the area stakeholders in the protection of those archaeological sites. You need to instill in them a pride of the different cultures that lived in that area and you need to indicate that that area could ultimately become a tourist destination if the monuments are preserved and could have an effect on their economy. Some would call this sustainable archaeology. So you need to keep the local residents involved in the archaeology of the site and protecting the archaeology of the site, because the looters are everywhere still. I mean, I don't know how many sites are being looted even as we sit here. So involving the local community is vital. That's what every archaeologist now tries to do, to the extent of reaching out to the primary school teachers and making sure that the children learn something about the respect for all the cultures who have left a monument or were part of the built environment of the site in place, so that as they grow older, they will grow older with a protective attitude toward the site. Now, this doesn't work in every case. It doesn't work in a lot of cases, but that is a potential way forward. Reaching out to the children and involving the residents of the area, trying to co-opt them as stakeholders in the protection of the cultural property in that district. Kate, yeah.
I have a follow-up question. In terms of preserving the cultural heritage, you have pointed out as the threat to those properties only of the locals so far. It's at least in this presentation, and I'm wondering. I don't want to assume. That's why I'm asking. Were there instances that you witnessed or you know of that the army, American army, has been the precise threat to those cultural heritages, which I can think of, like, for instance, looting itself. Like, were there instances that looting was happening? And the second one is bombing.
Yeah, there's no denying that there was a lot of cultural property that was destroyed in the course of the war over the last 10 years. Babylon, of course, is a case in point. A certain amount of Babylon was damaged as the base there expanded, as the Allied forces expanded the base of operations that they had established there. So when you expand a base, of course, if you dig down, if you see the soil change from brown to red, you know you're getting into the vicinity of a mud brick structure, and you have to stop, and they weren't stopping, in part because no one was telling them of the importance of the area. Because I should emphasize, I only reached a fraction of the men and women who deployed there. So a lot of bases, in the course of their construction activities, did damage a lot of cultural property in both Iraq and Afghanistan. How much cultural property was actually looted by the US Armed Forces, I don't have a figure. But I do know that if you had gone to eBay in 2004 or 5, and if you had done a search on any of the historical rubrics associated with the ancient civilizations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Babylonian, Sumerian, Assyrian, Akkadian, Bactrian, you would have gotten a phenomenal number of hits. I did this repeatedly. So there were a lot of antiquities, clearly, from Iraq and Afghanistan that were making their way to the States. I don't know exactly how they made their way. Did some of them come from the US Armed Forces? They may well have done, but I don't have the evidence to verify that. Were there bombings that resulted in the destruction of cultural property? Plenty of them. Who fired the bombs, or who fired the rockets? In war, you've got both sides, or all sides, firing rockets. So were some of the rockets fired by the US, and did they damage Iraqi and Afghan cultural property? Yes. That rocket that I showed in the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 1994, that of course was not a US rocket, that was an Afghan rocket during the Afghan Civil War. So in war, it's not just one side or the other that causes damage to cultural property. Cultural property is damaged for a variety of reasons by virtually everyone involved in the conflict, for one way or another. But was there damage sustained by the antiquities and the archaeological sites of Iraq and Afghanistan through the US incursion? There certainly was. Well, because I promised to stay in the time period of 50 minutes, so I deliberately held a certain amount back that I knew would develop in the course of question and answer. You have to remember there was half the audience wanted to go to another lecture at 6. So I deliberately didn't go into absolutely everything that I could have addressed in the course of that 50-minute lecture, but I can do it now. Please. But I speak very actively about looting when I speak to the U.S. Armed Forces. Looting is a big part of what, now that I have at least a day, or at least a morning, I can go into looting and the destructive components of looting as long as I want to, and I do that. So I show a looted site, even when I had 20 minutes, I would deal with the issue of looting. In one instance, I only had 15 minutes. Half of that 15-minute period was devoted to looting. So they're fully conscious of what happens with looting. I also, as president of AIA, lobbied members of Congress about stronger antiquities laws, stronger memorandums of understanding between the US and countries whose antiquities were being looted. And I would say to them, even the conservative congressmen who would say, well, we don't want to impose restrictions on free trade, and I would say, these antiquities that are coming into the US and that people are buying, who do you think is selling those? Those are being sold by the people who sell guns and drugs, and often women and children, to raise money and to start wars and to kill the service people whom you represent as a member of Congress. So unless you take a stronger attitude toward restricting looting, you are an accomplice to, I didn't say it quite this way, you're an accomplice to the murder of the service people whom you represent. And that would always, I'd at least get an intake of breath with that one, even if I wasn't always successful. But looting is a central component of everything I do as an archaeologist, everything that most of us do as archaeologists. Okay, this it would seem is the last question.
I would think the preservation of current archaeological treasures would probably be even more difficult to preserve. I'm thinking of the Stalin statue, whatnot, that those are always, in a prominent place. They have to be moved, and what museum, would be willing to take that and preserve it? Seems to me this is a bigger problem.
Yes, the destruction, I'm a big proponent of the preservation of dictator statues or of fallen ruler statues. There are, because these are historical documents. Say what you will about them, and of course many of them have been used to rally bigotry, to rally the forces of bigotry and injustice and hatred and sexism and homophobia and everything else. But to destroy history, for me, is a sin, any kind of historical document. So I would want to put, if it's in the center of a town, I can understand that that might create problems, put it in a museum. Now, convincing the people of that country to create a museum for those statues is harder to do. And so these historical documents are disappearing with a certain amount of regularity. For a long time, that statue of Marcos, the colossal head of Marcos, was allowed to stand as a testament to the tyranny that had once existed in the Philippines. And there has been talk of building museums in various parts of Russia to house the dictator statues. But these are metal in many cases, and people are interested in getting metal at the cheapest possible price. And if you melt down a dictator statue, you get it for free. Just the labor costs are involved. So it is a big problem, this stratum of historical documentation that we see disappearing before our eyes. And that's one of the reasons I always speak to the soldiers about it, in a way of encouraging them not to make the decision as to what is destroyed, really to destroy nothing.
I think that convincing people in the country is the toughest part. We probably don't have a Ku Klux Klan museum here in the States. What are we doing to preserve Guantanamo?
These are all legitimate questions. I don't know that we have time to address them tonight, but it is a legitimate question. Should there be a museum that features an exhibition on the Ku Klux Klan, I can't believe that there isn't, although I can't think of one right off the top of my head. But the fact that there was an organization, and I suppose in some places there still is an organization, that promotes the kind of bigotry that they espouse, that needs to be in a museum so that no one forgets about it.